In a remote African village, there lived a man named Nia who was known for his peculiar ways. Despite living in rags and having nothing to show for his life, Nia was always surrounded by happiness and peace. He never seemed bothered by his lack of material wealth, and his wisdom was unmatched. One day, the villagers decided to test his true worth. What they didn't know was that true wealth isn't always measured by what you own. The shocking truth about Nia's riches would change the village forever. Nia lived in a humble, small hut at the edge of the village, and his life was simple, yet full of peace. His clothes, ragged and torn, hung loosely on his frame, and his feet, bare and calloused, never seemed to mind the rough terrain. The village around him was full of people who prided themselves on what they owned: lush fields, cattle, fine clothes, and jewelry. Yet Nia never showed any interest in those things. He moved quietly through the village, speaking little, yet always offering a smile, a kind word, or a piece of wisdom when it was needed most. The villagers noticed him often, even when he didn't seek attention. They couldn't figure out why someone so poor by their standards could always be so content. Whenever there was a problem or someone needed advice, Nia would be there with a solution, one that was always rooted in kindness, patience, and understanding. But despite his wisdom and calm demeanor, no one could shake the feeling that there was something more to him. He had nothing to show for his life, no possessions, no family wealth, and yet there was something about him that made him seem richer than any of them. It wasn't that Nia had never been given opportunities. There had been moments in his life where wealth could have been his. He had been offered jobs in distant towns, places where gold flowed freely, but Nia had always turned them down. His heart, filled with contentment, was more focused on living a simple life, helping others, and finding peace within himself. It was a decision he had made long ago, one that shaped him and his future in the village. People were puzzled by this, unsure of how a man who lacked so much material wealth could seem so whole and complete. When the harvest season came and the villagers gathered for their customary feast, Nia would attend. He was always there, sitting quietly among the wealthier folk, but never participating in the boasting or showing off that others were so eager to do. The village's wealthiest men flaunted their riches, showing off their land, their cattle, and their grand homes. Yet Nia never felt the need to compare. His satisfaction didn't lie in what others had or what he could possess. He didn't need the material things the others so desperately craved to feel complete. The villagers began to talk amongst themselves, wondering why Nia lived the way he did. Some said he was crazy, perhaps too old to understand the value of wealth, but others admired him. They couldn't fathom why he was so content despite his apparent lack of wealth. It was as if he had discovered something they had all missed. This quiet man with his ragged clothes was somehow richer than them all. But still, the villagers struggled to understand. Despite Nia's peaceful life, the wealthier villagers grew more curious about him. One evening, a group of the richest men in the village gathered around the fire, discussing the mystery of Nia. "How can someone live so simply and yet appear so rich?" one of them asked. "What is it that he knows that the rest of us don't?" Another man, eager to uncover the secret, stood and said, "He must be hiding something. Perhaps he's pretending to be poor. I think we should test him. Let's see if he truly has no desire for wealth. If we offer him riches, we will find out the truth." So, the wealthy men agreed to challenge Nia. They decided to present him with an offer too good to turn down. They would offer him gold, land, and the finest clothes in the village. Surely, with so much on the table, Nia would accept, and they could finally understand his mysterious behavior. The next day, the richest man approached Nia as he sat under the shade of a tree, his eyes closed in meditation. They stood before him, their gold rings and necklaces gleaming in the sunlight. The leader of the group spoke first. "Nia, we've been watching you, and we don't understand why you live this way. You could have everything, the wealth we possess, the finest clothes, the best land. You could be a man of great power. We offer you all this. Nia opened his eyes slowly, taking in their words. He didn't rush to respond but instead looked at each man carefully. He could see the eagerness in their eyes, the belief that material wealth was the answer to all things. For a moment, he thought about the offer, but deep down, he knew his answer. He smiled softly and shook his head. "Thank you for your kindness," Nia replied, his voice calm, "but I have no need for your wealth. I already have all that I need. True riches are not in the things we own or the titles we hold. True wealth is found in peace, in love, and in the ability to be content with what you have. I do not need gold to feel rich." The villagers were taken aback. They had expected Nia to be tempted, to jump at the opportunity to improve his life. But his words were simple, yet profound. He didn't want what they had to offer. His life, it seemed, was already richer than anything they could provide. The rich men didn't know how to respond, and they left in silence, their minds filled with doubt and curiosity. As time passed, the villagers started to realize that Nia was right. The true wealth they had been chasing wasn't found in their land or in their possessions. It was in the peace they could find within themselves, the relationships they built, and the simplicity of life. Slowly, they began to change. They stopped measuring success by gold and land and instead started to value kindness, humility, and contentment. Nia continued to live his simple life, never once swayed by the offers of wealth. He had what he needed: peace, contentment, and the love of the village. And in the end, the villagers came to understand that the true wealth was not something you could hold in your hands, but something you carried in your heart. As the days passed, the villagers couldn't shake the unease and curiosity that had taken hold of them after their interaction with Nia. His refusal to accept their generous offers of land, gold, and fine clothing left them unsettled. How could someone reject such material wealth and still live so peacefully? It was not in their nature to turn down riches, especially when they had worked so hard to acquire what they had. Nia's reaction made them rethink their entire understanding of wealth. Was he playing a game, hiding something beneath his modest exterior, or was there a deeper truth that they couldn't yet comprehend? The villagers had spent their lives focused on amassing material wealth, larger homes, more cattle, precious metals, and fine garments. To them, these were symbols of success, the markers of a life well lived. They had spent so much time and effort collecting things, believing that the accumulation of these possessions would bring happiness and fulfillment. But Nia's refusal to partake in any of it made them question their values. He didn't need gold or land. He didn't even need the finest clothes, yet he had a peace about him that none of them seemed to possess. The leaders of the village, especially the wealthy landowners, couldn't rest easy with the thought that a ragged man like Nia could hold a secret to a better, more fulfilling life. They needed answers, something more tangible than words. And so, after much deliberation, they decided to confront him once again, to find out if he truly meant what he said or if there was something hidden beneath his humble demeanor. They couldn't let the mystery linger any longer. One evening, as Nia sat quietly near the edge of the village by the firelight, the village leaders approached him again. This time, they came with a plan. They would not just offer him gold and land, they would challenge his belief. They would show him that material wealth could provide more than peace of mind, it could bring power, influence, and comfort. "Why do you refuse our gifts, Nia?" one of the men asked, his voice laced with both curiosity and skepticism. "You claim to live a life of peace, but peace comes with security. Without wealth, you are vulnerable. The world around you is changing. How can you be content with so little when the rest of us strive for more?" Nia looked up at the men, his face as serene as ever. His eyes twinkled in the firelight, and he smiled gently, though his words were thoughtful and deep. My friends, the wealth you offer me is not the wealth I seek. You are right in saying that security is important, but security is not something gold can buy. Peace, joy, and contentment come from within. These are the treasures I hold dear, and they are not measured by the size of my fields or the amount of my wealth. The men listened, but their faces remained unchanged. They did not understand. They had lived their entire lives pursuing more, believing that one day they would be satisfied. Yet, here was a man who had rejected all they valued and seemed happier than any of them. It was infuriating. They couldn't simply accept that Nia had found something they couldn't grasp. Nia, you are mistaken, another man said, his voice tinged with frustration. Without wealth, how can you help others? How can you protect yourself from the dangers that come with poverty? If we are all truly equals, then why should you turn down our offer? You must have something to gain from this exchange. Nia took a deep breath, his calmness unshaken by their words. He had heard these arguments before, from others who had questioned his way of life. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate and measured, and addressed them with the wisdom he had gained from years of reflection. My friends, I do not reject your offers because I do not appreciate your generosity. I reject them because they are not the answers I seek. Wealth is not about hoarding possessions, it's about sharing what you have, helping those in need, and finding happiness in simplicity. My true wealth is in the relationships I have built with others, in the peace I feel within myself, and in the ability to face each day without fear or regret. Those are riches that cannot be stolen, and they are the true measure of a fulfilling life. The villagers were silent, their minds racing to process his words. The idea that wealth wasn't something you could accumulate, but rather something that grew from inside, was foreign to them. They had always been taught that more was better, that power and comfort were the goals to strive for. Yet Nia, in his simple ragged clothes, had a life that seemed richer than any of theirs. One elder, who had been quiet during the exchange, finally spoke. Perhaps Nia speaks a truth we have forgotten. We have sought wealth outside of ourselves, but maybe true wealth is something we already have, something we have overlooked. What if the pursuit of more is what makes us poorer in spirit? What if, instead, we began to seek contentment, kindness, and generosity? The others nodded slowly, their hearts heavy with reflection. They began to understand, not all at once, but in the quiet moments that followed. Nia's wisdom had pierced through their arrogance, reminding them of a simpler, truer way of living. His wealth was not defined by what he possessed, but by his ability to share what he had, his time, his kindness, his heart. As the evening wore on, the villagers realized that the life they had been living, in pursuit of material riches, had come at a great cost. They had been so focused on acquiring wealth that they had forgotten the importance of peace, of meaningful connections with others, and of the joy that came from living with contentment. The men who had once offered Nia riches now understood that he was richer than all of them combined, not because of anything he owned, but because of the way he lived. They realized that wealth, in its truest form, was not about gold or land, it was about how much love, joy, and peace one could give and receive. And in that moment, they began to change. Slowly, but surely, they started to embrace Nia's teachings. They would begin to seek the wealth of the heart, not of the material world, and in doing so, they would discover the true riches that Nia had always known. The days that followed Nia's response to the villagers' challenge were full of contemplation and change. The village that had once been focused solely on acquiring material wealth began to shift. People who had lived their lives accumulating land, cattle, and gold now started to question the very foundation of their existence. The more they thought about Nia's words, the more they realized that they had been chasing after something that wasn't truly fulfilling. His lifestyle, his peace, and the contentment he radiated, made them feel unsettled. They had so much, yet something vital was missing. As the village slowly began to change, so did the mindset of the villagers. They realized that Nia, the man who lived in rags, possessed something far more precious than anything their wealth could provide. The true wealth he spoke of, peace, joy, and connection, was something they had taken for granted. Now, with Nia's wisdom in mind, they began to turn inward, searching for the intangible treasures that he seemed to possess so effortlessly. Nia continued his daily routines, never rushing, never anxious. He helped the elderly with their chores, spoke kindly to the children, and offered advice when needed, but he never pushed his wisdom onto anyone. Instead, he waited, knowing that the villagers would come to him when they were ready. Slowly, they started to approach him. At first, it was just a few people, unsure and hesitant. But as they witnessed the changes taking place in the village, more came to seek his counsel. One evening, as Nia sat outside his small hut, watching the sun dip below the horizon, an elderly man named Te approached him. Te had been one of the wealthiest men in the village, a landowner with many cattle, a man who had never before considered that his possessions could be anything less than a reflection of his success. His face was weathered, and his once proud posture seemed a little bent, as though he had grown weary of the burden he carried. Nia greeted him with a gentle smile, inviting him to sit. Te hesitated for a moment, then lowered himself onto the grass beside Nia, his hands folded in his lap. "I've been thinking about what you said, Nia," Te began, his voice slow, as though the weight of his words was heavy on his shoulders. "You spoke of wealth in ways I never understood. I've spent my life collecting things, believing that having more would bring me peace. But now, I wonder if I was wrong." Nia listened quietly, giving Te the space to express his thoughts. He knew that change was never immediate, it took time for the seeds of wisdom to take root. "I've lost so much," Te continued, his voice thick with regret. "I've built my wealth, but I've sacrificed so much to do so. I've neglected my family, I've become isolated from my people, and now, even with all that I've gained, I feel empty. I thought I was rich, but I see now that my heart is barren. How do I change, Nia? How do I find the peace you speak of?" Nia sat back, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of the setting sun. He understood the depth of Te's question, for it was a question many had silently asked themselves but had been too afraid to voice. "True wealth, Te, is not something you can acquire," Nia said softly, his voice calm and steady. "It is something you cultivate from within. It begins with peace in your heart, with forgiveness, for yourself and for others. It is not in the possessions you accumulate, but in the relationships you nurture, the kindness you share, and the wisdom you give." Te's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in many years, he felt vulnerable. "But how do I begin? I've built my life on what I own, and now I feel like I've wasted it all." Nia smiled, placing a hand on Te's shoulder. "It's never too late to begin anew. Start with small things, offering help to those in need, listening to the stories of others, and showing gratitude for the simple things in life. When you give from the heart, you will receive more than you could ever imagine. You don't need to give away your land, Te, but you must give of yourself. The wealth you seek lies not in your cattle or your gold, but in the love you have to offer." Te nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of Nia's words. He had spent so many years accumulating things that he had forgotten what truly mattered. The love of his family, the trust of his neighbors, the contentment that came from within, these were the treasures that would bring him true peace. Over the next few weeks, Te began to put Nia's advice into practice. He visited the elderly, helping them with tasks that had become too difficult for them. He spoke with the young men and women of the village, offering them wisdom and guidance. He spent more time with his family, listening to their stories and offering his support. Slowly but surely, Te's heart began to heal. The emptiness that had once consumed him was replaced with a deep sense of fulfillment. As the village shifted its focus from material wealth to inner peace, the people began to come together. They no longer measured their success by what they owned, but by how they lived, how they treated one another, how they gave of themselves, and how they nurtured their relationships. The villagers found joy in the simplest things, sharing a meal together, helping each other with chores, and walking through the village with a smile. Nia's influence spread, and the village began to transform. The wealthiest villagers, once focused solely on their material possessions, now understood that true wealth was measured by how much love they gave and received. They had discovered, as Nia had known all along, that wealth wasn't in the things they owned, but in the peace they carried within themselves and the joy they shared with others. One day, as the village gathered in the center for a celebration, Tay stood up, his voice strong and filled with emotion. I once thought I was rich because of what I owned. But I now know that true wealth is found in what we give to one another, in the relationships we nurture, and in the peace we find within. Thank you, Nia, for teaching us the true meaning of wealth. The villagers cheered, and Nia, standing quietly at the back of the crowd, smiled. He had shown them the way, but it was they who had made the choice to follow it. True wealth, Nia had always known, was not in the gold or land one could possess, but in the peace, love, and wisdom one carried in their heart. And in that moment, Nia's wealth was clearer than ever. It was in the transformed hearts of the villagers around him. As the weeks turned into months, the changes in the village were undeniable. Nia's wisdom had begun to take root, and the once materialistic villagers now lived with a sense of purpose beyond their possessions. The transformation was gradual but profound. They no longer sought to measure their worth by the amount of gold or cattle they owned, but by how much love they gave, how much peace they shared, and how much gratitude they expressed for the simple blessings they had. The village, which once was divided by competition and greed, was now united by a shared understanding of true wealth. Nia's teachings had sparked something within the hearts of the people. They learned to find joy in small things, a meal shared with a neighbor, a conversation with a child, a day spent helping others. The villagers discovered that true contentment didn't come from material possessions, but from the connections they made with one another and the kindness they showed. It was a sunny morning when the village elders called for a meeting. They had been reflecting on the changes that had taken place since Nia's wisdom had begun to spread, and they wanted to discuss what they could do to ensure that the lessons of peace, love, and generosity would continue to thrive in the village for generations to come. At the heart of the discussion was Nia, as his example had been the catalyst for the shift in the village's mindset. Though he had no formal position or title, his quiet wisdom had earned him the respect of everyone, from the youngest child to the oldest elder. It was clear that the changes in the village were directly tied to the lessons Nia had shared with them. The elder known as Yemi, who had always been a strong advocate for material wealth, stood up at the front of the gathering. His face, once stern and proud, now reflected a new sense of humility. I've lived my life believing that wealth is something to be measured by gold and land, he began. But in these past months, I've come to see the truth in Nia's teachings. True wealth isn't in what you own, but in how you live. It's in the kindness you give, the peace you cultivate, and the love you share with those around you. Yemi paused, looking out over the gathered villagers. I've seen the transformation in myself and in others. I no longer chase after things that I don't need. Instead, I spend time with my family, I help my neighbors, and I find joy in the simple moments. Nia has taught us something that no amount of gold could ever buy. And I believe we must continue to live by this truth. The other elders nodded in agreement, and one by one, they shared their thoughts on the importance of maintaining the lessons Nia had instilled in the village. They discussed how they could pass these teachings on to the younger generations so that the cycle of greed and materialism would not return. We must teach our children that wealth isn't something to be accumulated, said another elder, Amina. Wealth is not in things, but in relationships, in respect for one another, in how we treat the earth and those who share it with us. Our children need to understand that happiness doesn't come from gold, but from the peace they find within themselves. As the meeting continued, it became clear that the village was on the brink of a new chapter. The elders decided to hold regular gatherings to remind the people of the importance of living with purpose and love. They also made a pact to help each other during times of hardship, to always be there for one another, and to ensure that material wealth would never be seen as the ultimate goal again. Meanwhile, Nia remained humble as ever. He continued to live simply, never seeking recognition or praise. He would often be seen walking through the village, stopping to help where he could, offering words of encouragement to those who needed them. His presence was a calming force, and people were drawn to him, not because of his material wealth, but because of the peace he radiated. One day, a young man named Sephiu, who had grown up in the village with Nia's teachings, approached him with a question. "Nia," Sephiu began, "you've taught us that wealth is not in possessions, but in peace and kindness. But sometimes, I wonder if that is enough. What if we need wealth to protect our families? What if the world outside our village sees us as poor, and we are at risk because we don't have the same things as they do?" Nia smiled gently, as he always did, and looked into Sephiu's eyes. "Sephiu, my friend, wealth may protect you for a time, but it can never protect your heart. The peace you find within yourself, the love you share with others, and the respect you show the world around you, that is what will keep you safe, no matter how the world changes. If your wealth is built on kindness, generosity, and peace, then no storm can take it away." Sephiu looked down, his mind turning over Nia's words. Slowly, he nodded, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Thank you, Nia," he said quietly. "I will remember that. The world may change, but I will remain grounded in the wealth that cannot be lost." As the seasons changed and the years passed, the village continued to thrive. The people lived simpler, more fulfilling lives. They worked together, shared their joys and sorrows, and supported each other through hardships. They had learned to appreciate the beauty in simplicity, in the relationships they nurtured, and in the love they gave. Nia, the rugged rich man, remained at the heart of it all. He continued to walk among the villagers, not as a figure of authority, but as a symbol of the true meaning of wealth. His life, simple and unassuming, had shown the villagers that the richest people were not those with the most gold or cattle, but those who carried peace and love in their hearts. And so, the village that had once been consumed by the pursuit of material wealth became a place of true richness, a place where love, kindness, and peace flowed as freely as the river that ran through the land. Nia's teachings had changed their world, and in doing so, had created a legacy that would endure for generations to come. As the village continued to evolve, the once overlooked principles of simplicity, peace, and kindness became the very foundation of its way of life. People who had once been focused on possessions now found joy in community, shared efforts, and relationships. They had learned, as Nia had shown them, that material wealth could not provide lasting happiness. The wealth that mattered was the kind that couldn't be seen with the eyes, only felt in the heart. And it was this invisible wealth that bound the villagers together in ways that gold and land could never have achieved. Nia continued to lead by example, but not in the way the villagers had initially expected. He never asked for accolades, recognition, or titles. His life was a testament to the truth that the richest man is not the one with the most possessions, but the one with the most contentment, compassion, and peace. His simplicity had become his strength, and in his quiet humility, he became the cornerstone of the village's transformation. One morning, as the sun rose over the village and painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, Nia sat by the river, as he often did. His weathered hands rested on his knees, and his gaze was distant, as though he was contemplating the many changes that had taken place in the village. It was here, by the river's edge, that he felt closest to the earth and the world around him. It was here that he had first understood the true meaning of wealth, a lesson he now shared with all who crossed his path. Nia's calm demeanor and gentle presence continued to attract the attention of those who sought to understand his secret. Some came to him in times of hardship, others simply seeking guidance in the quiet of their hearts. And Nia always welcomed them with patience, offering wisdom that transcended the limitations of worldly understanding. One day, a group of young men approached him, their faces filled with questions. They had grown up in a village that was once driven by the pursuit of material wealth, and now, as the winds of change swept through, they found themselves uncertain of how to navigate a life that focused more on internal fulfillment than on external possessions. Nia, one of the young men asked, his voice tentative but full of genuine curiosity, "How do we know if we are truly following the right path? You taught us that wealth is found within, but how do we measure our progress? How do we know if we've truly embraced this way of life?" Nia smiled softly, his eyes reflecting the wisdom of his years. He had learned long ago that the path to true wealth was not a destination but a continuous journey, one that required constant self-reflection and the willingness to grow. True wealth is not something that can be measured by external signs, Nia said, his voice steady and warm. It is not about how much you give or how much you receive. It is about the peace you feel in your heart and the love you give to others without expecting anything in return. If you seek to change your life, you must first change your heart. Look not for success in the eyes of others, but in the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing you are living with integrity, compassion, and respect. The young men listened carefully, absorbing every word. There was a sense of understanding that began to blossom in their hearts, an understanding that Nia had been planting in the village all along. The lessons he imparted were not abstract or complex, they were simple, yet they carried the weight of a lifetime of wisdom. And with each new lesson, the village became a place of deeper peace, a place where material wealth was no longer the measure of success. As Nia's influence spread, the village transformed in ways that no one had imagined possible. The bond between neighbors grew stronger, and the ties of community became unbreakable. No longer did the villagers strive to outdo one another in wealth. Instead, they supported each other, sharing what little they had and finding joy in their collective strength. The once bustling marketplace, where people had competed to buy the most lavish goods, now felt quieter, more peaceful. People still traded, but the focus had shifted. The greatest treasures exchanged were not gold or silver, but simple acts of kindness, wisdom, and shared labor. There was a new sense of purpose in the village, a deeper understanding that wealth was not found in possessions, but in how they treated each other, how they cared for their land, and how they nurtured the next generation. In the years that followed, Nia's teachings lived on in the hearts of the villagers. When they gathered together, they no longer spoke of their possessions but of the relationships they had built, the peace they had cultivated, and the joy they found in the simple things. The idea of true wealth became ingrained in the culture of the village, passed down from one generation to the next. Children grew up learning that the wealth of their ancestors was not something to be inherited in material form, but in the love, respect, and peace that was shared. As Nia grew older, he remained a constant presence in the village, not as a teacher, but as a humble reminder of the path to true wealth. His health began to decline, and the villagers knew that his time on this earth was drawing to a close. But they also knew that the legacy of his teachings would live on in them. When the day came for Nia to leave this world, the entire village gathered to honor him. They didn't bury him with gold or jewels. Instead, they planted a tree in his honor by the river where he had spent so much of his time. It was a simple tree, but it grew strong and tall, its roots deep in the earth, just as Nia had been a solid, unwavering presence in their lives. The tree became a symbol of everything Nia had taught them, of peace, love, and the quiet richness that can be found in simplicity. And so, Nia's legacy lived on. His teachings became the heartbeat of the village, passed from generation to generation. The villagers, once driven by the pursuit of material wealth, now lived rich lives in ways that could never be measured by what they owned. The true wealth was in their hearts, in the love they shared, and in the community they had built together. Nia, the ragged rich man, had shown them that the wealth of the spirit could never be taken away, and it was that wealth that would continue to thrive in the village long after he was gone. The people, now wise and content, understood that true wealth lies not in what you have, but in how you live, and that was a lesson worth more than all the gold in the world.